Welcome to the Shetland Times podcast. I'm your host, Thor Holt. Today I'll be speaking with Jacqui from Australia. Apologies, there's a couple of line quality issues with the Skype line. I'm sure it's Australian technology fault rather than us here, but see what you think. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Jacqui. And remember, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the podcast. You can leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to the show. Or indeed, you can communicate with Adam Civico at the Shetland Times, or you can get in touch on the Facebook page. Hello.
Sorry about that. I had a problem with the internet.
I thought Australia was ahead of us.
We are.
You're more advanced.
9 hours ahead.
No, I mean more advanced.
Technology. Yeah, no, afraid not. Anyway, we've done it. Thank you. Thanks for bearing with me. This is great. This is a great project. The diaspora, the Shetlanders. It's an interesting place to come from, yes. And most people, but actually Australians are interested. They love Scotland. Australians love Scotland, and there's a lot of Scottish descendants out here. So it seems to go down quite well. And I'm actually living sort of 100 metres from a road called Rosswatt Road. Mm-hmm. And the Rosswatts in Gisborne, which is the town I live in, just about an hour out of Melbourne, they're interested in themselves. So apparently there was a Watt on the First Fleet. That came to Australia, although I don't know whether it was a rally or, what they'd done wrong or where they came from. I don't know anything about them because there was a Watt on the First Fleet, I'm told. So, yeah. Have you been to Australia?
I have. I've been to. Yeah. I lived in Sydney for a few months in a house, cool. Yeah. A house called the Zoo. It's on Darling Harbour, and there were like 30 people from all over the world. And it was pretty crazy. The end of a night of drinking would involve this guy who had his BMX bike there. He would do a bunny hop off the fence into the pool, and that was like the conclusion of the evening. So it's kind of crazy. But why did you go away then? Because you actually sent a list of perfectly plausible questions, like why do people go away from Shetland and why do they come back? So why did you go away, Jacqui? That might be a place for us to start.
Well, I suppose I first went away to university when I was 17, so that's, first trip away from home was to Edinburgh University. And then I went back when I graduated. So, we were in the middle of Thatcher's Britain, and like all students, I had a massive overdraft, and I knew I'd get work in Shetland, whereas in Edinburgh I'd be competing with, 20,000 other students for whatever work was available, 1984. So I went back and worked for the council, actually, for a couple of years, and then sort of early 20s thinking, what am I still doing here? I've paid off my overdraft and, not the most interesting place to be when you're young and want to have a bit of fun. Well, that's not true, actually. It's a great place to have fun. But so I left to my sister was in Cardiff, my oldest sister, and I got a job with a drugs project. They were setting up the new drugs projects in the 80s. So it's when the Tories finally realised that there was a drugs problem in Britain, having been in denial for a long time. And so I ended up living in Cardiff in South Wales for 4 years. And basically I've just moved around a lot. I've always followed the work, I suppose. That's how it's kind of happened. But in 2000, I came back. So I left in 86 and went back in 2000 with my then husband to take up the job of basically deputy CEO of the council. So they'd created, Morgan Goodlad had come in as chief exec, and they'd created a whole set of new departments. And this was community services. So the brief was like all community services. So it was education, social work, housing, and community development. Yeah, it was kind of all the people services on this one department. So it was, career-wise, it was a terrific move. And I was back there for 5 years, and it was just fabulous, actually, going back that bit older and a bit more established in your life. It was great opportunity. And so I was part of serving the first and only politically coloured council in Shetland. They had what they called the experiment with the Lib Dems when they actually stood on political tickets and had a caucus and all that stuff. Shetlanders didn't like that very much, and that only lasted for one term, but it was a really interesting time because Morgan had been in the role about a year. And we were facing the charitable trust cuts, which are now, I gather, coming home to roost, and that we're just trying to get councillors over the line to make some tough decisions, but also to engage the community in the whole conversation about what we could really afford. It was an interesting time. I don't know that we got that far, but it was a really interesting time to be back there between 2000 and 2005. So I was there for the Island Games, which was brilliant. And I did really enjoy being back in Shetland, and I've still got my house in Tingwell, which is tenanted at the moment. But yeah, and then I got a promotion to Scotland and worked as chief exec for the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations for nearly 5 years before I came to Australia, which is where my brother has been since 1988. So I suppose he was a refugee from Thatcher's Britain as well. Came out with all his mates from, Scalloway, Lerwick, that sort of area. And he's still here. So he's had his family here. And I'd visited him a few times, and then it just seemed like... So I've always followed the work, Thor. Like, I've always got jobs and then gone somewhere. It's not that I've just kind of wandered about kind of aimlessly, I guess. Although it wasn't really intentional either. And I didn't think I'd still be in Australia 7 years on, but I met my second husband here and I've married, and doing what I'm doing now. So
what are you doing now? I've looked at your LinkedIn profile and it says you're the CEO at No to Violence, which sounds like a very sensible idea, saying no to violence. I'm all for that. But what does it actually mean? What do you do?
So it's a men's organisation. I suppose it's the leading specialist male family violence prevention organisation in Australia. It's been in existence for about 20 odd years, and we do a combination of things. So we advise people on prevention strategies for family violence. We train people to work with men who engage in family violence. We have a phone line that operates in 3 states in Australia. So we've spoken to about 200,000 men over the years. So we know a thing or two about how they present and levels of denial. And so one of the reasons I took that job was because there's a lot of focus on family violence at the moment. I think there is in Scotland as well. And we had someone here called Rosie Batty, who's a British woman who her son was murdered by her husband in broad daylight in a nice middle-class part of southeastern Melbourne. And she basically went on the media straight away. And then became the Australian of the Year a few months later. Mm-hmm. So she's been a champion and advocate, and as a result of that, that became an election issue in the Victorian state government election in 2014, and the Labour government were then elected with a promise to have a royal commission into family violence in Victoria. So that deliberated so that was coming up when I took up this job, and that deliberated for about a year, and we're now working through this massive systemic reform process in Victoria. So it's really quite exciting and quite interesting. And if I think back to when I worked in housing in the 80s, there wasn't even a refuge in Shetland. So I, as a housing officer, part of my job was working with Women's Aid and others to get the first refuge going in Shetland. So there is a connection back through all that.
Mm-hmm. A lot of folk from Shetland do travel, including myself, having lived in Australia for a wee bit, but not everyone's been to Australia. So what would you say is the differences? Might be a place to start between life in Australia and life back home in Shetland.
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, it's a pretty obvious one, the sunshine. It's kind of an obvious one, isn't it? And look, I think Australia actually compares with Shetland. I find Australians really open and easy to get along with as people. Also, it's sparse. I mean, the cities are, as you know, Sydney, Melbourne, they're pretty jammed and hugging the coast. But once you start going inland, it's a very rural agricultural economy, and it's very, very, very vast and spaced out. And so I guess the similarities are they're both islands, although one's extremely small and one's extremely big. But no, I find the people really good to get along with, and that's the thing I like about Shetland as well. You can just stop and chat to somebody, and the day passes because there's really no rush. And once you get into the bush, it's sort of the same in Australia.
Are you in the city? Sorry, do you live in the city?
So I work in Melbourne, so I commute in each day, and it's about it's a lot of commuting actually. It's about 90 minutes each way each day. And we lived in Melbourne until 3 years ago. So, but now we're just an hour out. So we're right back in a place called Mount Macedon. So we're in it's kind of like a suburb, but it's not. It is more rural than that. Yeah.
I was just wondering what it's like where you actually live then, because my experience of getting outside of Sydney was, as you say, it pretty quickly gets extremely rural and very, very sparse and quiet. So the town like or the village like that you live in? So
Gisborne's it's a bit like Lerwick, to be honest with you, without the sea. The thing is, around Melbourne you've got so many funky little places that, they've got lovely cafes and textile stuff going on, and people are really crafty and quite creative and quite into the sustainable life. They recycle everything out here. I mean, I look at some stuff and go, oh, that's really old and crappy, and they go, oh no, it's vintage, it's retro. Like they're a bit like the Americans. They're always trying to create their own history because they're really conscious that they haven't got a longish history. So Gisborne is quite a small town, probably about 5,000 people. Gosh, I should have checked that out, really. The shops aren't that great. We've got one good cafe now, but do you know what I mean? It's sort of in between the funky places in Melbourne, so it kind of hasn't quite got it yet somehow. But it's a place to live. We live 5 minutes from the railway station, so I go in by train in the mornings, and it's a pretty good service. And you go to the station in the morning, it's freezing cold. You've got the cockatoos going around. You've got the magpies. You're freezing cold. By the time you get to Melbourne, it's at least 5 or 6 degrees hotter, because we're like 450 metres above sea level here. So we get frosts up here. Mm-hmm. So the challenge is for the garden, because we've got quite a big garden, the challenge is that plants have to be both drought and frost tolerant. Mm-hmm. But they also have to be able to cope with the occasional flash flood and the heavy downpours. So it's a kind of a mad, it took me a while to get adjusted to the climate, and I would say 7 years in, I'm probably just getting used to it now. I couldn't make sense of the hot north wind. What's that? Hot north wind, that does not compute. And when I first got here, people said, oh, you'll love summer, because I came in autumn. I came in March. And you'll love summer because it stays light till 8 o'clock at night. And I was like, 8 o'clock at night? I'll show you light. Which is why we're coming back in midsummer this year, because I love the mids. I always miss Shetland in the summer dim. When I lived in England, then I remember the first time I went to Glastonbury, 1987, and it was middle of June, and it got bloody dark at 9:30, and I was like, what's this? And my friends pointed out, you are actually 650 miles south of where you come from. I just expected it to be light all the time anyway. Yeah. So lots of good things about living in Australia. There's a good quality of life here, same as there is in Shetland. That's not to say it doesn't have its social problems or its poverty or whatever, but it's a pretty kind of equal and even society. They're pretty committed to equality, even though we have an interesting government at the moment. And you'd never see a Trump emerging in Australia, I don't think. I mean, there's Trumpites. There's people who are minded that way. I realise I seem to be talking a lot about politics. I didn't realise I was going to do that. Yeah.
That's fine. You can talk about whatever you want, Jacqui. I don't mind. I'm just interested in, and I think listeners will be interested in your experience there. But also part of that is the political landscape. It is interesting to hear how the political life there is as opposed to over here in the UK from your perspective. So that's cool. You talk about politics all you like.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks. Yeah.
You're welcome.
Somebody said to me. When I got here, that the difference between Scotland and Australia is that when you work in Scotland, people rock up to you and say, oh, don't worry, I'm not going to stab you in the back, Hein. I'll stab you in the front. You'll know I'm doing it. And in Australia, it's a much more passive culture in many, many ways. It's worth studying in itself is how people in Australia respond to leadership and authority. And I wonder if some of that is connected back to that whole thing of how it was created. And set up as a convict colony, and then the free men became the settlers. And there's something going on in the psyche of Australians. And the mistake I think I made when I first came was looking at it and thinking, well, the political system's like what they call Washminster. It's based on Westminster, basically, and people speak English most of the time. Most of them are white. I mean, it's actually a very diverse country, but, your first impressions of government and all these places. And so it kind of looks the same. It seems to operate on the same rules. And then about a few months in, I thought, no, none of this is making any sense to me at all. And I realised I had to unlearn all the things because I left my job in Scotland in March, had 2 weeks off and started a job in Melbourne. I didn't actually give myself a lot of time to just land and kind of suss it out, and I hadn't been on an extended holiday or whatever. So it can be easy to misread things. And there's nuances to how people respond, and people are enormously positive and friendly and all the rest of it, but the way they show their rebellion, I suppose, or the way they resist change is just slightly different. It's just slightly less easy to read. And I guess like any immigrant to any new country, you can make a lot of mistakes, and you kind of want to prove yourself. You kind of want to prove that you can deal with it and all the rest. And it wasn't until I got to that moment where I thought, I need to throw out everything I think I know and just start with a blank sheet of paper, and then I'll be able to understand what's actually going on.
Can you give me an example of when you misread it? Because you were saying it was easy to misread.
Yeah. Well, when somebody tells me to go for it, I tend to go for it, and I didn't realise it meant go for it, but not like that. And it's a bit like, I mean, and actually in Scotland it was the same, but the response was different in Scotland. So, you know, the whole saying about you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. You know, when you're doing organisational change, which I suppose I've done a lot of over the years. People will say, oh, I object to that because, and I don't agree with that. And you kind of know where you stand. Whereas here I was kind of carrying on doing what I thought was the right thing. And then it was coming to my attention through more sideways ways, that somehow that wasn't what people wanted, and that I was going too far or too fast. But nobody came up to me and said, oi, you know, I need to tell you something. I had to find it out the hard way. So yeah, I probably don't want to go into any more detail on that particular one, because that was my kind of baptism, I think, when I first got here, about realising I had misread the situation completely, and feeling a bit stupid. Like, you feel a bit daft, because you think, well, hang on, I know this stuff. I know housing policy inside out. I know how to run a social housing organisation. I know how to advocate. I know how to lobby. That's my thing. So yeah, and I mean, I guess, you know, I didn't, and Victoria is interesting as a state anyway, because all the states and territories have got slightly different characteristics with them. But I wouldn't be anywhere else other than Victoria, because it is actually probably the most exciting state from a social policy point of view, in terms of reform and change. So we kind of lead the way, and we kind of tell the whole of Australia that we lead the way. So of course they love us.
So
yeah. No. So in terms of housing, so if you think, I mean, I grew up in a council house in Scalloway, and when we were growing up, nearly half Scottish people lived in public or social housing. And of course, in 1980, then Margaret Thatcher brought in the right to buy legislation and sold off a lot of the houses. Suddenly, people got mortgages, and people were homeowners, and all the rest of it. And the home ownership rates between Australia and Scotland are actually very similar now. They're about 70%. But when I got here to run the Community Housing Federation, I realised that social housing was less than 4% of the total housing stock. So it's a completely different scale. And there were a lot of people who wanted to make the community housing, social housing side of things bigger and better and stronger. And they kind of wanted to model it on Britain. But the trouble is that you can only do that if the government takes its responsibility seriously and basically underwrites it through some revenue support. And what I found here was that our members, because we were a member-based organisation, could only charge rent based on people's incomes. And they could only charge, I think it was 25% or 30% of people's incomes. And they also had to house the people on lowest incomes. But at the same time, the government wanted them to not just break even, but to make money and to go to the banks and borrow money, but still to house the people in most need without. It doesn't add up. It really doesn't add up. So that was I was trying to make sense of that, and at the same time deal with this thing that they call negative gearing, whereby they basically offer a tax subsidy to people who buy properties as investment. So whereas in our country we would get double taxed if we owned a house that we didn't live in, here you're encouraged to do it, and you get tax incentives. And so private investors buy properties as investment properties, run them at a loss, and then write off that loss in their tax return.
Yeah.
So essentially, there's billions of lost tax revenue, but there's also an incentive for people to own more houses than they really need, which also means that people who want to get on the housing ladder can't get on it because prices are kept high because of that demand. So I'd never come across anything like that before. Yeah, totally different.
Fundamentally different.
So the policy settings look similar, but they're not. That's right. Yeah.
So you did mention there, Jacqui, being born in Scalloway, and I wonder if you've got any memories of growing up there. I've got from the earlier email you sent me, you were born in 1963 in Scalloway. So I was born in 73 on Papastua, so 10 years after you. But I've got strong memories of my early kind of years there. But what are your memories like?
Oh wow. Yeah, well, it's such a different place now for what it was then. I can remember, because oil was coming on the go, and how exciting it was when a helicopter went overhead, because this was the oil companies that were starting to explore the North Sea. So I was lucky, I think. I think our generation were lucky, because we grew up with that there was growth and change, and new people coming in. There was a flood. There was obviously 6,000 men parked up in Toft, building the oil terminal. And things went crazy. Like people were coming off the boat and sleeping in doorways to try and get a job, because Britain was starting to go through a real decline in high unemployment and stuff. So But see, I grew up. My dad was born in Shetland, but my mum was from Glasgow. So, and they had met during the war. So her take on Shetland was very different because she had grown up in a big city and had come here as a kind of war bride and was horrified to discover that there was no cinema and no restaurant. And, I mean, believe it or not, Scalloway was dry. When my mum arrived, Scalloway was dry, and she said, "For a dry place, I have never seen so much booze."
What dry as in there was nowhere to buy alcohol back then?
No licenses, no official licenses. That's right. Yeah. So it was dry, but it wasn't dry. I'm sure Papa Stewart was a bit like that as well.
Good, no comment. I shouldn't go into those
I've
stories.
been to Papa Stewart. No, the joy of doing the job in Shetland between 2000 and 2005 was I got to go to all the small islands. I got to Fetlar and Papa and Fair Isle, and I'd never been to, and Fulla. I'd never been to any of them. And the other thing was I got flown in by my cousin Eddie, who most people know as Eddie Watt. He's my first cousin.
He's your cousin, is he? Oh.
My first cousin, and when we were flying out to Fair Isle, and he did the dive-in thing, he did the coming in by the cliffs thing, but we were going over Havre, and he was pointing out where people used to live down in Havre, because of course our granny had taught in Havre when it was still populated. And Oxna, actually. Oxna had people on it as well. So it's just such a stunning place. I probably didn't see as much of it as a child, and I was happy to leave in my 20s and go off and do other things, but it grows on you, I think, as a place we mean in as you get older, and that's maybe just partly getting older and realising how important family and connection is, but it's also just so special and so different.
What would actually tempt you to go back then, do you think?
It's always a possibility, because as I say, I consciously have maintained my property and just don't want to part with it. It's in such a special place. It overlooks Tingle Loch, and it's very close to the what's it called, the Ting, and the graveyard and all of that. And it's actually such a beautiful place, but it's probably one of the few places you can see the sea. You know what I mean? It's actually inland, considering I think the thing I miss out here is being near the sea. Mm-hmm. So if we were ever to move in Australia, I'd want to get down the coast a bit. And yeah, I still got family and friends back there, and that's, I said, we're coming up for 3 weeks in midsummer because I promised my Australian husband that it does stay light all night, and he's going to go outside and read a book at midnight and prove to him that can. So they better put the weather on for us. If it's that sea misty, grey kind of dark way, I'll be most disappointed. I'll be asking for my money back.
Most dischuffed. So if somebody came to you, Jacqui, and said they were thinking of moving to Shetland, or maybe just going for an extended stay, what advice would you give them? I ask everybody this before we wrap up a conversation on this podcast.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'd say is you've got to talk to my pals, and they'll take you to the best places, and they'll tell you where to go and where not to go, and they'll entertain you with great stories, and they'll be very hospitable. So that's always better to go to a place when you've been. In fact, I did recommend it to a woman I met in Alice Springs a couple of years ago, and her husband were going on a walking holiday. Their son was in Edinburgh, and she said, "Oh, well, we really want to go to Shetland." And I said, "Well, you must go, but here's my friend's email address and here's her phone number." And so they did, and they had a great time, and they did a walk up to Fideland. And she wrote to me and said, "That was just so fabulous, thank you so much." So yeah, I would say to them, you've got to gird your loins for the weather and the wind, because it's not just the cold and the dark, it's the wind, and it's not actually that cold, but there's just an awful lot of the year when you don't have much daylight. So certainly for Australians, I think that's a pretty hard gig, because most Australians struggle even be living in London over the winter, because they're just so used to having so much more light and warmth. But what I also say is the insides of our houses are warm, because in Australia the way they build their houses leaves a bit to be desired. Yeah. Don't start me on that one. I go on a soapbox, because I think it's especially in Victoria. I think it's that mentality of the gold rush. They built a shack. They didn't bother putting windows in it. They put a corrugated iron roof on in a 40-degree day. Yeah. And so there's this kind of cavalier attitude towards construction methods and stuff. And because I worked in housing a lot of my career, it's like I find that, why would you put single glazed windows in? Because double glazing actually keeps the heat out as well as keeps the heat in. Stuff like that, and people look at me like, oh, what's she creating a fuss about? Like, that's how it is.
So the advice there from Jacqui, Shetlander in Australia is, to Australians going to visit Shetland, take a look at the building standards while you're there and maybe bring some home with you.
Absolutely. Great idea. Yeah. And it's insulation and double glazing. It's not that hard.
You can't beat it.
Yeah.
Nice one. Thanks, Jacqui.
Yeah.
We'll wrap it up there.
Yeah.
We're looking at roughly half an hour there. Really appreciate you coming on and talking to us. Thank you so much.
No worries. Thanks so much, Thor. Hear you later.
Hope you enjoyed that conversation with Jacqui Watt in Australia. And please do get in touch. Let us know what you think of the show. Leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to the Shetland Times podcast. And do remember, of course, that the Shetland Times is about more than just the newspaper. And there are sponsorship opportunities for this podcast. Let me know if you're interested in them. You can connect with me direct at Thor Holt on Twitter, or you can communicate with the Shetland Times via the website, shetlandtimes.co.uk, or through the Facebook page. See you next time.